Welcome back. So my name is Sylvia Richardson. I'm currently director of the MRC Biostatistics, but will step down at the end of this year. And we've already introduced Professor John Whitaker as the incoming director. So it's great pleasure for me to introduce the main event of the day, the 18th Armitage Lecture, which will be delivered today by Professor Gianluca Baio. But before I formally introduce Gianluca, I would first like to thank those involved in the preparation of this successful and widely recognized event, which this year, for the first time, we have run as a hybrid event. Sadly, last year, we decided to cancel this annual event, and so it was with some trepidation that we planned to host today's event. And I'm particularly pleased that we were able to have this event today, and we have over 250 participants registered online. So welcome to you all, and thank you for attending from far away to this special event in the Biostatistics Unit calendar. The scientific lead, as we've heard from him from our Armitage celebration, is Dr. Brian Tom, program leader in our unit, and he put together this excellent program of speakers that we've heard today. So I want to thank you, Brian, for your leadership in bringing today to the fore the topic of decision-based inference. As you could imagine, and particularly this year, a great deal of planning and preparation needed to be accomplished behind the scenes to organize and promote such a successful event. This year, organization has been particularly challenging in view of the high uncertainty on the state of the COVID pandemic and ever-changing health guidance that we get from the University of Cambridge. So Alison Kuno, that you've seen today at the beginning and who's been very present throughout, and Isabel Ronaldson have been instrumental in bringing together all the arrangements for today's workshop. And they had to constantly adapt the details of their preparation. So we're extremely grateful to both of them for their hard work, which has ensured the successful and smooth running of the day we've had. So can you please give a show of hands? So as Brian actually explained this morning, our lecture series began in 2003 and was established by the MRC Biostatistics Unit to honor the work of an outstanding medical statistician, Professor Peter Armitage, and we're very pleased that he is able to join us virtually today. Peter Armitage's work is recognized throughout the world and has had a profound influence on defining our field of biostatistics. And his wide-ranging contribution from stochastic models for cancer processes to sequential trials methodology exemplify how marrying statistical methodological rigor with an in-depth understanding of the applied problems makes a substantial impact on progress in medicine and public health. And it is these dynamic interactions between method and applications that we strive for collectively in the BSU. And so we're greatly honored that Peter Armitage has allowed us, as Brian explained, to associate his name with these annual lectures. Now on to the highlight of today. I would like to introduce this year's Armitage Lecture, Professor Gianluca Baio. Gianluca is Professor of Statistics and Health Economics at University College London and has recently become Head of Department. I'm particularly pleased to introduce Gianluca, as we've known each other for a good many years. We first met when I was professor at Imperial College, and he just moved to the UK to work with Phil David. He was already very active in the community of Bayesian statisticians working in the field of biostatistics and health economic. Since then, we've had many stimulating statistical encounters over the years, including working together on using observational data and the regression discontinuity design to perform causal inference in an MRC-funded project of which Gianluca was the PI. Gianluca is a leading recognized expert in the development and application of Bayesian statistical methodology in the health field, with wide-ranging work on statistical modeling for cost-effectiveness analysis and on using a principled decision theoretical approach in health systems analysis. And of his many outputs, I'd like to point out that his influential book in 2012, Bayesian Methods in Health Economic, which was then followed by an associated book with an R package, BCEA, and that he recently edited with Emmanuel Le Saffre, a book on Bayesian method in pharmaceutical research. So it's an enormous production for the community of all of us, and thank you very much, Gianluca, for developing both the theoretical side and also the implementing side, and then the communication side. So, and I think this is the ethos that you've given to your research groups, that you've built a very strong research groups on statistics for health economics evaluation within the Department of Statistical Science. And as far as I know, your group works in close collaboration both with academics within and outside UCL, but also with other collaborators. And you're trying both to have seminar aimed at statisticians, also at health economists and clinicians working on economic evaluation. So it's really a remarkable breadth of work and activity. Besides being involved, very active in the UK, Gianluca is also involved in international statistical community. He was program chair for the biostatistics and pharmaceutical statistics section of ISBA. I've just heard that you're on a program committee of the next IICB. You also collaborate with NICE. You've been editor, associate editor of GSSA, so you're giving a lot to the community. But now, without further ado, I'm sure everyone is very impatient to hear from you, and so I will hand over the microphone to you and invite you to deliver the 18th Armitage Lecture.
Well, too kind. Thank you very much, Sylvia and Brian, for the invitation. And absolutely, I'd like to second my thanks to Alison and the committee that has organized this event, which has been fantastic. Obviously, a lot of people during the day have remarked how fantastic it has been to actually be able to be in a room with other people physically, real people, and experience that feeling once again. But I can only imagine how hard it must have been. So thank you very much, Alison, for all the organization. So, what I should say is that, as you probably figured out by my name, or maybe you know me already, I'm Italian from origins, and this has been quite a remarkable year for Italy overall, because we've experienced a lot of traumatic events last year particularly, but then this year we started having maybe unprecedented and surprising events happening to Italy. Well, first, in May, we won the Eurovision Song Contest in Rotterdam for the first time in 30 years. And then that was already something. Then in June, July, we won the Football Euros. And by then, a lot of people in Italy, including me, were just thinking, well, okay, that's fine. Let's just relax now, go to the seaside and enjoy the summer. Because surely we've had a very good run. And, normally we don't get that. But then in August at the Olympics, we had even better things, displaying a huge diversity in the team of participants, which was unprecedented, and even winning gold in athletics for the 100 meters, the relay, high jump, things that had never happened to us. And again, people thought, oh, well, that's just awesome. We're having such a fantastic run. Surely it can't go on. And in September, the women's team actually won the Euros in volleyball. And a week later, the men's team decided that they wanted to be just as impressive, and they also won the Euros there. And to make things worse, by October, we also won a Nobel Prize, which again doesn't happen every year. And in November, this, which obviously for me is just an incredible honor. And to be here today, to have been invited, to have Professor Armitage in the virtual audience, this is just an incredible honor, and really makes me think that it can't get better than this, but also makes me very kind of worried and scared, because as a statistician, I think I always have at the back of my mind, regression to the mean and all that business. So I'm thinking next year in January, we'll have to elect the new president of the Republic. And I mean, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen there. So it's very mixed feelings. I'm very, very happy and very honored to be here, but I'm very worried about what's going to happen next year for EC. I love Obama's face, by the way. It's just when I'm very sad, I look at this slide picture and I'm just happy then. Anyway, so I realize I've sort of wasted a couple of your minutes of your life, a couple of minutes in your life just saying nothing. And essentially, I thought maybe I should introduce myself more directly, although Silvia has done a fantastic job, well, too kind, in fact, as I said. It probably is not as impressive as when I do it in front of a different audience, because I'm assuming that a lot of you, most of you, will be coming from statistics. So if I tell you that actually I think the statisticians should be in charge of everything, maybe you're not enraged, or maybe not as enraged as economists or clinicians are when I tell that at conferences. Maybe some of you will not like particularly my follow-up to that, which I think that Bayesian statisticians should actually be in charge of everything and everyone. But, so just so you know what to expect in the next few minutes or so. Okay.
My PhD is not in statistics. I'm cross-appointed by many computer science, and I will say I agree with you.
Okay.
Most people don't understand risk and uncertainty, and statisticians do it everything, right?
What? Awesome, I've won already. Okay, so let me give you a brief outline of actually what I'm trying to talk about today. So, as Silvia said, a lot of my research is about health economic evaluation. And I'll try and talk about a bit what it is, and maybe go through a bit of history of the whole discipline and how does it work. And then I want to spend a bit of time in trying to sort of linking this up into, well, statistics, because obviously, because of what I just said, I think that this is very much central, a key feature of what we call health economics or economic evaluation, HTA. There's lots of different names that we can associate to that. And I have a running example here, which maybe links to some of the things that we've seen this morning, which is about kind of using survival modeling in health technology assessment, HTA. And then I'm going to talk about value of information, which is actually key to the whole process of making decisions based on inference and evaluating what the impact is of acquisition of new data into making the decision. And then I'll stop talking, because by then you'll be all be bored. Okay, so what is health technology assessment? What it actually is essentially a discipline which is fairly new. In fact, I'll come back to that in a second, where the objective is to realize that medical interventions do not only have one dimension, which is probably what we're mostly used to when we're doing clinical trials, for example, or epidemiological analysis. We're interested in the effectiveness of some intervention, which could be a drug or simply something that happens in the population. In reality, HTA in general has the objective of combining this dimension with another one, which is about the cost of implementation, and more importantly, the opportunity cost of actually implementing an intervention. So the idea is that we have finite resources, and we can't do all the interventions. We can't make all the drugs available that are produced for a given population. And we have some trade-offs and some decisions to make. Some drugs might be more valuable because their cost-benefit profile actually is good enough to maximize the objectives, which is to make the best possible for the whole population, or for as many people in a population. And of course, this works across different areas and different diseases as well, because we may decide to invest a lot of money in cancer, for example, but because we don't have infinite resources, then we will be left with much less money to invest in cardiovascular disease or anything else. So there's a balance that we need to strike. And I think what in a nutshell, HTA tries to do is to find out a way of working that balance. Like I said, this is a very new discipline, a relatively new discipline, in fact, and it basically became a thing in the 70s, particularly starting in the US and then moving across into Europe and then Australia. And I think, well, I don't know, maybe I used to say that just to make the economist in the same room with me angry, but I think that the name and the terminology, HTA, health economics, is kind of a historical accident. Because yes, the discipline was invented, developed by economists, but has since developed so much that the sophistication of the models that we need to use in this particular case has kind of moved away from the simple idea of a simple economic model that people can just run in an Excel spreadsheet. It just doesn't work like that anymore. And actually, what I'll try to argue in the next few slides is that statistics has the central role. We call it health economics if you want. In my view, this is statistics, one of the nicest and most interesting and challenging applications that we can find. And also, this is a truly world-beating British sort of enterprise in many ways. Sylvia has mentioned that I do work with NICE. NICE is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, although the acronym comes from the original name, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE. And since its establishment in the late 90s, NICE has become the sort of the powerhouse of HTA globally. This is the place where things are developed and guidelines are made, both methodologically and in terms of the application of these methods. And then there are, to some extent, follow through across different various parts of the world and different agencies in the world that have a function that is very similar to NICE. Like I said, its establishment dates back to the late 90s, in 1999, in the very beginning of the first New Labour's government. And it was mostly due to the work of the then Health Secretary, Frank Dobson, who, despite pushing a lot and making a lot of hard work to make NICE happen, when asked whether it would work, simply replied, well, probably not, but it's worth a bloody try. And he was very insistent that actually that was the right thing to do. It might not have immediate results, but it was the right thing to do. Mainly, the driver was the idea of tackling inequalities and imbalances that were present in the NHS system in the UK at the time, mainly due to the idea of the postcode lottery. At the time, a lot of the decisions were happening at the local level. So essentially, patients living in Richmond upon Thames might have a very different provision than patients living in Newcastle, for example. And obviously, that was generating a large level of inequalities in access to the best healthcare resources, and therefore down the line in terms of the outcomes as well. So the idea was that there was this concern that it was generating a vicious circle within the NHS. And that was the attempt at kind of standardizing the whole process, and also at driving up the quality nationally, because essentially there would be one single body making the decision about which interventions the NHS should pay for. I say nationally here, although technically NICE is responsible for guidance to the Health Secretary for England and Wales, to some extent. The Scottish have a slightly different system with a slightly different body, and I think that is a bit confusing, which is always confusing to me in terms of how the UK works, pretending to be a federal state when it's not, but that's a different story. And the idea was also to depoliticize the reimbursement and coverage decision, because there would be a body independent of the government who would make those decisions. And again, that was seen as a very progressive move at the time. Like I said, NICE wasn't necessarily the first body to be created with this remit. And in fact, I think that the very first one was in Australia, PBAC, and there were already experiences in New Zealand, in Canada at the time. But it was a very fertile moment for the whole of the HTA community, and a lot was happening across Europe with the Dutch regulator, Scandinavian countries, and later on then Spain, France, Italy, kind of following suit. Since the very beginning, NICE had a very strong approach to the things that they were doing. So the very first drug appraisal in which they were involved in the year 2000 was about an antiviral treatment, Relenza. And essentially, NICE did what it was set up to do. They trawled through the whole body of evidence that was available to determine whether not only did the treatment work, but was it worth paying for? Which is what they have to do, essentially. And their conclusion was that there was insufficient evidence to say that the treatment was actually having the best effect on the most affected people. So essentially, it couldn't reduce the severity of the illness for the people who were mostly at risk. And therefore, their recommendation was that the treatment should not be funded by the NHS, which didn't really go well with the manufacturer. And at the time, the CEO of then Glaxo Wellcome allegedly threatened that they would leave the UK if the decision weren't reversed. Now, obviously, you can imagine how these things are actually real, and they have a lot of implications, because obviously we can take an academic stance and just say that, you know, we provide NICE with the methods and the methodology to make their decisions. But there's a higher level anyway at which the decisions might be made in terms of the political importance of that they can have. Nevertheless, I think that it is crucial that we have this system with this methodology in place to drive the process, because otherwise we're just left with the negotiation and the politics of it without a fundamental grounding in science. In this particular case, after some further deliberation, Relenza was made available in the UK on the NHS, but only on a limited basis. Is what we call a restricted population. I'll come back to that later on when I'm talking about sort of survival modeling. It just kind of shoot off. After that, they started to do several assessments, and this is one of the first few next assessment, which was about determining that essentially removing healthy wisdom teeth was not a sensible thing to do. It was just a waste of money. So they kind of scrapped their policy. And very often, decisions made by NICE are encountered with a lot of controversy in the media, for example. And this is kind of intrinsic in the sort of work that they do, because they have to decide based on evidence and kind of separating themselves from for the more emotional consequences of their decisions. So I think this is another famous case back in 2000 and something, I can't remember when it was. And essentially, NICE was called upon deciding whether a particular treatment for children should be made available on the NHS. And in that instance, what they found is that there was so much uncertainty that essentially the cost per outcomes was so large that they couldn't afford it. And that is a horrible decision for the parents and the family of that single child who might be saved by that treatment, and they can't get it on the NHS. But essentially, the NICE and then the NHS tend to work across the whole population. And so there's a sense in which that was a decision that was justified in some sense. And also, and I'll come back to that later, there's a huge point related to making the decision, which is about the way in which we arrive at the evidence that drives that decision. So I'll promise you earlier on in my manifesto that I would make statistics great again, and this is where I start to do that. Like I said, when we have this objective of combining the cost and the benefits, perhaps already we'll start thinking that a lot of this process is driven by things that we already know as statisticians. The benefit side of things is probably the kind of modeling that we have seen earlier today during this fantastic day. So for example, Chris has shown some of the population health modeling that might enter models like this. So what we all need to think about is essentially an extension of that side of things that we are very familiar with to deal with the second dimension, the kind of the costs. So it seems to me all of this business, actually, we can call it health economics and not make the economists angry, let's just say. But really, everything starts with a building block, which is a statistical model. And typically, it is a very complicated statistical model because it's based on composite evidence that comes from different sources. It sort of answers questions about different parameters in the model, which may have to do with some kind of baseline incident of a given disease, and then the relative effect of a set of treatments, which we may find through perhaps individual level studies randomized from a specific drug, and then observational data on other drugs which may be relevant for their particular area of interest. So this red box here can be a very complex statistical model. And I think that's where, as statisticians, we should get really excited, because it is very interesting to work in this kind of models here. And in any case, the objective, as for any stats model, is to estimate some relevant population parameters. We want to figure out, for example, the baseline incidence, like I was saying, or the average survival with a given treatment, or the cost of being treated for a specific disease in hospital, and so on. And the way in which we do this, of course, can vary depending on the type of data that are available, whether we have individual level data or aggregated level data, and the kind of approach that we take, whether we're Bayesian or a frequentist, although we should be Bayesian. And then the output of the stats model essentially feeds into a separate second model, which is the economic model, whose job is essentially to apply these functions, I'm calling them Fe or Fc, to distinguish between the effects, the benefits, and the costs, so that we can calculate some kind of measure of differential population value for the benefits and the costs. And of course, this is driven by the estimation of the model parameters. And again, these may vary depending on what the stats model feeds into it, because we may have individual level data that already gives us the variables that we need. And so the functions Fe and Fc are essentially identity, and everything is very simple. We can move from the red to the gray box with no extra complication. Sometimes those functions are actually very complicated and highly nonlinear, because maybe we have a set of parameters that we're estimating, and we have to combine them in a nonlinear way to determine the average cost and benefit. Once we've done that, we can kind of, well, we shouldn't stop thinking really, but in terms of the actual computation that we need to make at this stage, we could almost stop thinking, because we follow the rules of decision theory, and we know that essentially what we have to do is to compute some kind of expected utility associated with each of the interventions that we're interested in, and then select the treatment or the intervention which maximizes the expected utility. And given current evidence, that would be the best course of action. So in here, essentially what we do is to combine these two functions, these two values, delta E and delta C, with given functions, G and H in this particular case, to determine measures that would allow us to make a decision. If X, then the new treatment will be the best one and we should pay for it. If not, then stick with the old one, kind of thing. So, are we done? Well, there are some problems. The first one is that we have measures, particularly for the benefit side of things, which often are not necessarily aligned with what we're most used to see in, say, clinical trials. In health economic evaluation, one of the main measures, and I think Chris has mentioned this earlier this morning, is this idea of QALYs, quality adjusted life years. And the reason for that is because we need to kind of make create a measure that is comparable across different disease areas. So you could count the number of people who die of a given disease, but that wouldn't be fair if we're comparing ways of allocating money to cancer research versus cures for your headache. Of course, you don't die of headache most of the time, luckily, but it may be just as a big thing as cancer, because perhaps if you have a headache, you don't go to work, and that has repercussions in terms of your productivity. Maybe you can't look after your children, and blah, 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 blah. So the idea of using QALYs, which aren't a perfect summary of this combination of quality and quantity of life that we earn from a given intervention or treatment, is a necessity that we have to be sure that we can compare across different disease areas. Because again, when we're doing a clinical trial, most likely we're interested in the comparison of a single drug, maybe against placebo, maybe against another active treatment. When we're doing this, we're interested in allocating a certain amount of money, which is an externality, the government will give it to us, to everything, and to every person for whom we are responsible in the NHS. And the other complication is that, well, because this is kind of an arbitrary definition, essentially, the QALY, so the amount of money that we are prepared to pay to ensure advantage in terms of increasing QALYs for a given population, is very much dependent on things that happen outside of our own model. So in many ways, the threshold per QALY, the amount of money that we should be okay to spend to increase QALYs by 1 unit, varies a lot depending on the jurisdiction, which in turn depends on whether the system is fully funded in terms of public money or fully privatized or a combination thereof. So we're not really finished, even if we have a clear pathway from the stats to the decision model. And so what happens is that we also have to account for the fact that the output from the stats model, which is the primary entity of this enterprise, is never a certainty. We don't know that the baseline incidence of a disease is 60%. Maybe on average it would be 60%, but there's always going to be some measure of uncertainty around it. We don't know what the true treatment effect is. We only have some potentially uncertain estimates of them. So the idea is that we need to take a detour, and rather than just going on a straight pathway, which is what we would do if given current evidence and the evidence were perfect, we have to try and assess the impact of the uncertainty coming out of the red box onto the gray box, the economic model, and then downstream to the decision analysis. This is a process that is sometimes called probabilistic sensitivity analysis, or more appropriately, I would say, uncertainty analysis. And what I would argue is that this is a fundamentally Bayesian operation. The idea that essentially we want to propagate the uncertainty coming out of the stats model all the way down to the decision analysis, so that we can make a decision and we can also assess how uncertain we are about that decision. The reason I said that this is essentially a Bayesian operation is that if we're doing it in a frequentist way, essentially what people tend to do is to kind of separate out the process of estimation from the process of propagation of the uncertainty. So you have this kind of two-step process that I've mentioned in the slide to your left, where essentially we first feed to the economic model the point estimates to calculate the base case scenario, and then we kind of resample using perhaps something like Bootstrap from a pseudo distribution of our model parameters, and we feed those simulations into the economic model to have a full distribution of decisions. In a Bayesian sense, you don't have to do this kind of artificial separation between these two steps. We have a model which might be ideally the same as it would be in a frequentist setup, but through the machinery of updating our prior distribution into a posterior, given the data that we have observed, then that's directly the quantity that we feed into the economic model. And using simulation algorithms such as Markov chain Monte Carlo, then essentially we already have a simulation process which directly generates a distribution of decisions, which we can then summarize using the mean of that distribution as the base case scenario. So essentially the process is kind of the other way around. Instead of having a point estimate and exploding it out by artificially creating some uncertainty, if we're being Bayesian, we already determine the full uncertainty around the best decision or the most likely decision that we could make. Let me show you a quick example, which then would lead me to talk about how we deal with the uncertainty in the evidence body and what should we do with that. So this is very similar, once again, to things that Chris has presented this morning. This is essentially, in the HTA literature, we call it a Markov model. In stats, we might call it a multi-state model. And this is a very prevalent model in the cancer study area, where we have these three states, and we assume that patients can only be in pre-progression, or progress to have worse disease, or die. And essentially, the transitions across these three states are characterized by these arrows in the graph, and the lambda values represent the transition probabilities, so the rate at which people can move across these different states. And what the HTA community does is to create some kind of cohort models where we have a virtual set of individuals, maybe all starting from pre-progression, and we sequentially make them move across the different states according to the transition probabilities. And we do that simulation for a lifelong time. So we start with everybody in pre-progression and we stop when everybody dies 50 years from now. So, of course, the idea is that we want to estimate these transition probabilities. The structure of the model is a given. We assume that that is reasonably correct. It's not the truth, of course, but it's close enough. And then we want to use evidence and a stats model to estimate the transition probabilities. So the idea of doing this probabilistic sensitivity analysis, this PSA, is essentially that when we have a bunch of parameters, and maybe we've selected these three different distributions because they are either the posterior from our model or some pseudo simulations from some distribution that we think is reasonable to represent uncertainty around the parameters. And then we sequentially simulate from this distribution. Ideally, and if we're Bayesian, that's easier to do, from the joint distribution of all of these things, because there can be a lot of correlation across the parameters. So simulating independently might miss out on that important aspect and actually inducing bias in the overall decision-making process. So we simulate one value, we feed it to the economic model, we compute the decision analysis, and that's our first simulation. That's our first draw from the posterior distribution of the decision analysis, essentially. And then we do it again by simulating a different profile for the parameters of the model, and then we feed them into the economic model, and then again we come out with some results for the decision analysis. And we can keep doing it over and over and over again until we have a full distribution of the whole decision process. Now, we can summarize that by taking the mean benefits and costs across the different interventions and compute statistics such as the ICER, the Incremental Cost Effectiveness Ratio, which is a measure of cost per outcome kind of thing. So if we have some threshold, and if the ICER is above the threshold, the intervention is not cost effective and therefore should not be implemented or reimbursed by the NHS. If it's below that threshold, then we have the green light, at least in theory. So what is the problem with a model like that, which is based on survival data or time to event? Now, like I said, this is very prevalent and it's not surprising. If you work in trials, you know that obviously cancer trials are one of the main areas that we see. But in here, we have a lot of extra complications. So the first one is, if we're doing a trial, we are working for whoever is sponsoring the trial. It may be a pharma company, it may be a hospital, it may be a university. And typically, the medical statisticians working in that trial do have access to all the information that is available, the individual level data. But there's an extra complication. When you're doing a trial, most likely it would be against placebo. Placebo is not an option when we're doing a decision analysis because placebo isn't on the market. We wouldn't give placebo to the patients. We're past that stage. So what we need to do is to compare our data, which we might have at the individual level, with effectiveness of other treatments, which may already be on the market or may be available for similar indications. But typically, these are produced by companies that are competitors to the one that is already trying to prove that the new treatment is cost-effective and should be reimbursed by the NHS. Therefore, we're unlikely to have access to the individual level data for all the comparators that are of interest to us. The second thing that is potentially complicated is that often, and particularly for some class of new drugs, immuno-oncology especially, the data are characterized by a huge amount of censoring. And I'll show you an example in a second. That might be kind of okay from the MedStats perspective. We can still go to Lancet with our paper, even if we are in that kind of situation. But it's horrible for the economic model because we need the kind of extrapolation over a long time. And therefore, we're kind of making up information on the basis of very little data that we might have because it's characterized by a lot of censoring. And then there's another thing which always bugs me, and I try to always sort of be self-righteous about it and tell people, you should do it the way I say. And essentially is this divorce that I often see between the people who work on the benefit side of things and the people who work on the cost side of things. And it's not always like that, of course, but often there is a lack of statistical sophistication on this side of the analysis. So
Which side
the last sophistication is at the economic analysis side. So in terms of including the benefits model into the cost evaluation. Often the medical team at a pharma company do a fantastic job in doing their survival analysis. There's nothing to say. You can question the method and you can say, I would have done it that way, you know, like we always do when we do refereeing of papers. It goes a bit deeper when we look at the whole picture and the other side of the story. And I think a lot of that is because there's a divorce, like I said. It's not always the same team that work on both sides of the story, which they should, in my view. So this is to just briefly show what I was talking about in terms of the kind of extrapolation. You may have data from your trial, and if you're looking at the median survival time, which is often what we would do in a Lancet kind of paper, you get some result. But what we really need is an extrapolation over the long time, potentially lifelong, which means that we want the survival curves to go all the way down to zero and make sure that we have an evaluation of what the true difference between the active treatment and whatever else we're contrasting it with is. And as you can see by those numbers there, we might have a very biased result if we only look at the limited amount of time rather than the whole lifelong extrapolation. And of course, this is a recipe for disaster. And that's going back to me being very Italian and getting really worked up about pizza. And you have to do it right. You can't just have that thingy on the left-hand side. And the problem is that, of course, because we need to extrapolate, typically we need to use parametric model. We could do a bit better with sort of semi-parametric models, but still we have this element of extrapolation. And that means that there are different models that we can try. And essentially what we need to do is to fit the model to the observed data and try and see whether they do well enough. And in this case, if you fit a Weibull, which is the red, and the gamma, which is the blue, well, there isn't an awful lot between them to kind of discard completely one of them. And then when you do the extrapolation, you might have, however, very different results in terms of how the mean survival time is calculated, because one might have fatter tails than the other. And of course, we don't just restrict ourselves to two simple models, because NICE have guidelines and they say, well, you should try a bunch of different models. So we might have a picture like this, and often we do have a picture like this. Now, the exponential model is the one at the top, and it's clearly not right, because it's just all over the place. So we just discard it, that's fine. Everything else, it's a lot less clear-cut. So there are ways in which we can try and judge where is the best fit. But is modeling enough? Do we need to bring external information? Can we be cleverer about this? And in a sense, should we be Bayesian? And again, the answer is always yes. So the idea is that, of course, we can try and use methods like, information criteria to check that the fit to the model is okay. And in this particular case, the exponential has the highest AIC, so we would just discard it and just say, well, even visually, you wouldn't use it. And there's very little to tell apart the Weibull and the gamma model. Although maybe you would say, well, okay, let's be very strict. The Weibull has the lowest AIC, I'm going to use that. But even if that was a bigger range, and that would make your decision more justifiable, the point is that these methods, and all of these methods, actually measure the fit of the model to the observed data. And what we really care about is the extrapolation period. And there's nothing that we can say about that because we don't have the data. So we're just making that up. And this matters because, like I was saying, there are cases. This is a real case. I think it's one of the NICE assessments. I think it's NICE TA 174, where the observed data were like that. So you have a Kaplan-Meier that doesn't even reach 0.8, essentially. There's huge censoring. And that happens a lot of the time, particularly, like I was saying, with immuno-oncology drugs, which seem to have a lot of good response, or kind of a plateau in terms of the survival curves. And what we do here is extrapolating the model and seeing that at 15 years, the best fitting model gives an estimate of the probability of still being alive, which is like greater than 75%. And maybe the clinicians would just go, you don't know what you're doing, just go away, that's impossible. These people have cancer, they can never survive 15 years. So we need to find ways of formally and quantitatively define how should we go about collecting more information and feeding that into the decision-making process. Enters VOI. Now, I thought I was being very, very clever because I saw these scooters when I was in Milan, and I thought, oh, that's going to be very good, and I'm going to blow their mind. And then I came to Cambridge, and I noticed that they're all over town, so maybe it's much less impressive than I thought it would have been. But, and I was going to make a big splash. VOI is a very popular method. Look, they're doing merchandising as well, but it's just all gone. I'll sue them. So what is VOI, value of information? I'll just have a couple of very, very silly examples. The idea is that you may have a situation where the decision is actually very, very uncertain. So you may end up in a situation where the probability that the new treatment is cost effective is kind of 50-50, is only marginally above the 50-50 range. So, if we get it wrong, however, we have very little to lose. The overall increase in cost is just £3 for the whole of the England population, and the decrease in effectiveness is basically nothing. So you may be in a situation, which of course I'm artificially exaggerating for comic effect, which has large uncertainty, but the consequences of these uncertainty are nothing, are negligible. So who cares? We can afford the uncertainty if we are in that situation. Or you may be in the opposite ridiculous case, where you're almost sure that your new treatment is actually better. You know, there's a 99.99999 chance that you get it right, that the evidence that you have at the moment tells you that the new treatment is better and it will be better in the future. Except that if it's not, in the 1 in a million times that it is not, then everybody dies and you would have cost a gazillion pounds per person in the process. So you don't want to take that little risk, because even if the uncertainty is tiny, the consequences are dire. So if you are in a situation like that, you want to think about it. Before you make a decision, you have another decision, which is stop and get more data. And this is very much linked to the example that I was showing earlier on, because if you have survival curves and extrapolations that you don't really trust, then maybe you need to think differently in terms of how you deal with that particular intervention. And again, it points to me, and I've stolen this from Nikki Welton, who's one of our collaborators, and I think she's done this brilliant slide to show how cyclical the process should be. And I think often we do get caught in the process and we think that we've done our trial, we've done our analysis, and then that's it. But it isn't really, because once the drug or the intervention is on the market, say, or maybe reimbursed, then it all starts over, and we collect more information, more data, we update our analysis, we get information about what it is that we should know more of, and then keep repeating. So it's never stopping, essentially, which if you take this away from looking at the actual maths, essentially what it means is there should be a lot more space for what they call conditional reimbursement of interventions. So something being put on the market for a limited amount of time with a view of collecting more information to reduce uncertainty on key parameters, and then the decision has to be revised down the line, because we gain more information and therefore reduce the uncertainty and therefore are more sure about making the decision. Let me try and go through some of these ideas. Essentially, VOI has this kind of underlying assumption that a new study will give you more data, and that would potentially reduce, and in an ideal world, even eliminating uncertainty about all or some subset of the parameters. And if you do that, you can update your cost effectiveness model and kind of check what is the change in the net benefit, which is the measure of utility with which you then make the decision. If the optimal decision would never change, even if you had more data and reduced the uncertainty, then essentially there's no point in waiting and collecting more data. You might as well just make the decision right now and select either the new or the old treatment. If you think, and the model tells you that actually there's a good chance that the decision could be reversed if you had more information, then actually the decision is stop, get more data, and do this over again. So the expected value of information is the average gain in the net benefit between these two situations. And there are different measures of this. I'll probably need to skip one of them because of time, but there's one which is highly idealized, and it's called the expected value of perfect information, and is the ridiculous scenario where we have a study of an infinite sample size which allows us to learn perfectly all the single parameters in the model, i.e. would never exist, obviously. But this is interesting because it would give us an upper bound on the amount of money that we should put on extra research. So essentially, it's good for us to evaluate the uncertainty in the current decision-making process, although it is a highly idealized measure which has no real value in practice because we could never have that. Something in between is what we call the expected value of partial perfect information, which is the idea that, well, it's not about everything, because my model could have 100 parameters, and I would never be able to learn all of them. And even if I could, maybe I don't want to learn about all of them, because some are out of my control anyway, so there's nothing I could do about it. But I could restrict to finding out which is the subset of parameters that is driving the uncertainty the most. And then that's where I would concentrate and do a study to learn more about them. So this is about something that is a lot more tangible, and it should kind of drive, in some sense, both the uncertainty analysis and the research prioritization for the next stage of the process. But it has the limitation of still thinking about something that would completely remove uncertainty about the model parameters, which again doesn't happen. And then there's the final one, which is the EVSI, expected value of sample information, which is about thinking, okay, what if I did this specific study with this specific design to collect this specific data? What would I gain? Would it change my decision? So this is about research prioritization at the highest level. And for example, you could think of things like this to drive sample size calculations or the actual design of a new trial for a specific set of parameters. And of course, going down from 1 to 3, you increase the usefulness of these measures, and at the same time, you increase massively the computational complexity of doing this. So in general terms, any VOI measure is made by comparing some idealized decision-making process, which could be resolve the uncertainty about everything, or resolve the uncertainty about something, or add more fictional data against the current decision-making process. So the difference in these two quantities, on average, is the VOI measure, the EVPI, EVPPI, or EVSI. And there's some intrinsic complexity to this, because, for example, this isn't a probability, it's an unbounded measure. So if I told you that the EVPI was 600, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything, because you don't know what's the scale of this 600. So there are things that we can do, and they work, again, nicely in terms of the more sophisticated measures, things like the expected net benefits of sampling, which is the difference between the value of getting more data and the cost of getting more data. And again, if that is positive, then there's more value than cost. If it's the other way around, you shouldn't do it because you would be wasting your money, kind of thing. And like I said, there are computational and modeling issues. So in the interest of time, let me just skip the EVPI, which is just a very simple measure. And essentially, you could do this in a spreadsheet. I won't talk that much about it. But it's based on information that you gather from the PSA process, from having simulations for your model parameters, calculating a distribution of decision models, essentially. And then you can decide to look at the idealized decision-making process as if you had resolved the uncertainty in each of the single rows of this table against the actual decision-making process, which is kind of averaging over the uncertainty in all of these lines. So again, it's the difference between the expected utility under perfect information and the expected utility overall. But like I said, this is easily to do, even in an Excel spreadsheet. People don't normally do it because it's hard to interpret and because essentially, we don't get that much out of it. This PPI is a lot more interesting, both from the stats perspective and the applied perspective. And like I said, the idea is that we divide the model parameters, which could be very, very many, like 100, into a small subset to which we are very interested, and another one which is everything else. And the idea is, what if we could do something to learn about this little subset of parameters that we're really interested in, given everything else, leaving everything else as it is? Would we change the best decision-making process? And if so, then we should stop and get more data. So essentially, all boils down to kind of a conditional version of this difference between expectations and maximization of utilities. So essentially, the core element is this conditional distribution of the net benefit. And the conditional element comes from the fact that we are assuming that fixing the value, having learned the value of phi, what would be the overall expected utility once we have done that study that has told us that phi is actually equal to 32. Of course, we never do that because we don't know that specific value. But if we did, then we could calculate the best decision by simply maximizing that conditional expectation. And because, again, we can't do that, we have to average over all the possible values of the small subset of parameters that we're interested in and contrast that with the actual decision-making process that we have right now. And so the difference between these two things is what we call the EVPPI. And the problem with that is that the red element there, the maximum of that expectation, is very hard to calculate. And we could do some kind of nested Monte Carlo integration there, but it takes forever. And that has been one of the main arguments for not implementing any of these in practice. But there have been lots of literature, lots of work in the past few years, originally from Mark Strong in Sheffield, then Anna Heath did fantastic work while at UCL, and other colleagues as well. So this isn't a problem anymore. The computation element isn't a problem. And essentially, what happens is that we found ways determining this estimation using Gaussian process regression or GAMS models, which are very efficient and quick to run. And what you can do with these things is determining summary of PSA in terms of the lower curve there, which basically is telling you for a subset of parameters, when does it change the decision and how much does it increase the payoffs of changing the decision. And also obtaining graphs like that on the right-hand side, which basically is telling you how much of the current decision uncertainty is due to a specific parameter, to the fact that I don't know a specific parameter really well. And if I look at a ranking plot like that, then essentially that says that the parameters at the bottom of this table, of this graph, are just irrelevant to me. I could do a simple study to learn more about them, but why would I? I don't care. They don't drive the uncertainty. If I have £1 to invest, I should invest in learning about the parameter at the top. So that should drive the research prioritization. And even further, it's important because there are, like I said, methodologies that allow you to do it. And there's been a lot of work to make this accessible to the practitioners. And this is a web app that Mark has developed at Sheffield, and there's a link there if people want to play around with it. In terms of EVSI, and I'll be really quick because I'm mindful of the time, again, the idea is to kind of separate out what happens right now given current evidence, which is essentially this idea of a model which is based on a combination of sources of data. You might have literature reviews, clinical trials, expert opinion, observational data, healthcare registries that all feed into your model to estimate the parameters that determine the economic model, and then that determines the decision-making process. So this is a slightly different version of the graph that I showed you earlier on. And the idea of EVSI is that, well, what if I stop? I take the information that I have right now about theta, about the model parameters, and I use that to design a new study to collect new data, X. And then once I have collected those data X, I can obtain a posterior from my model parameters, and that's what I would input into my economic model to then have an updated output in terms of the decision modeling. So again, it's a sense of that iterative process going further back on and on again once you have more data. And the idea is that we have to make a model that tries and identify what is the expected value of obtaining data from a specific design. And again, the formula are not that important right now. I think there's a lot of work that some of the people in various groups have made, and there's a paper there which will be out very soon on the current status quo, essentially, of the research about EVSI. And the idea is that with this kind of method, what we can do is determine, okay, I'm asking for money from the MRC to do a new research, and I can show to the MRC that I'm expecting that the value of this research will be quantified in X million, say. And I'll show you something in a second. Again, this is very computationally intensive, and there are different separate methods that have been developed more or less independently, and I'll talk more about this, this development in a second. So one of the things that Anna Heath has done is determining for her PhD work this kind of visualization of an EVSI analysis for a specific trial design. So essentially what you could provide as the output to your model is the probability that the trial becomes cost effective, that it gives you enough information so that you can make a better decision down the line. And as you can see there, that will depend on separate variables. For example, the time horizon at which the intervention is active in the market. And you can estimate that by looking at how many similar drugs are on the pipelines or registered trials are for similar things. And of course, if everybody is studying that kind of area, it is likely that tomorrow or next year or in 2 years, a new intervention will come out, which maybe kind of tip you off from being the best one. So you can have an estimate of the time horizon of how long will the technology be included and paid for by the NHS. And also, on the y-axis, the incidence population. So obviously, if this is about 5 people in the world, then you're unlikely to have a return that is very positive. The probability of a cost-effectiveness trial is close to 0 if you have very few people who are affected by that technology. As soon as you move to higher incidence population, then you start having a gradation until you end up in the y area, which says, well, you're almost certain if this is the situation, if you have about 8,000 people that are affected by this technology, and you're assuming that it will stay in the market for about 10 years, you're almost certain to get a positive outcome from this trial. Positive outcome being learning enough to make a better decision that will be the right decision down the line. And this can work in terms of determining the sample size of a different study, because again, you can calculate the economic value in terms of the expected net benefit of sampling, the difference between what you get in terms of monetary value from gaining more information versus what you need to pay to actually get there. And the more expensive the trial, the better it has to be in giving you information to change the main decision. And what we have here is a comparison of two interventions. The black line is a study where I think we're assuming that there is a financial incentive. So you give people like a voucher so that they turn up and do their measurement. And the gray line is a similar design without the kind of incentive. You don't pay them to get and give you their measurement. And as you can see, the economic value of the black version of the trial actually crosses zero. And if you increase the sample size, this trade-off actually is negative, and you end up losing money. If you did that version of the trial, you were losing money. The optimal sample size with the gray kind of curve is around 30 patients. So if you have a study with 30 individuals, you maximize the gains in terms of learning more so that you can make a better decision. And the standard sample size calculation for a trial like this, I think, was something like 70 or 75 patients. So you gain a lot as well, because you completely change the metrics against which you assess the validity of the trial or the benefits of the trial. So if I have just one more minute, yeah. So a sad story in just one slide, because I get very excited about these things and I really love them in a very nerdy way. And you may think, oh, that's just incredible. Maybe the things are really changing and they're doing things really well. Kinda. NICE have just updated their methods guidelines, and they have decided that value of information measures are not to be made mandatory. So they're basically saying, well, you know what, it's all good and well, but you know, we don't care. Just don't do it. Don't make it a formal requirement of your dossier for cost effectiveness. And apparently some stakeholders argued, well, we know that some stakeholders argued that, well, this is wrong. You have to do something about it. But apparently there was a strong push from industrial representatives who basically said, well, that's too difficult. We don't know how to do it. There are methods. Yes, you guys have been good. You've been worked on this, but we still don't understand. Which again, to me, screams about the need of pushing up the boundaries of this discipline in terms of the statistical background. We need a lot more statisticians who understand what they're doing and can work on these different methods. CADF, who are the Canadian regulator, interestingly say something that is more positive. They don't recommend that people use VOI measures, but they say that they will accept it. And I don't know why the decision was made in a different way. I suspect the Canadians are nicer people, perhaps. Okay, so quick conclusions. So HTA, I think my main takeaway would be, it is fundamentally based on statistical modeling. Don't be fooled by the many economics, quantitative objectives that you see in this title. This is about statistics. And if you are statisticians, you can get excited like in a nerdy way I am about all this. And I think we should all be very much more involved in the whole process. From the upstream, where we are already and we do the clinical trial stuff, downstream to the decision analysis, because it's still our job. And I think VOI methods are very helpful. They can be very helpful, and a lot of the barriers have gone away. We still have a battle, but bear with us. And there are lots of people who are trying to kind of win this battle. There's a couple of consortia, international consortia. The first one is RHTA, and I think the main remit here is to move people away from inadequate tools like spreadsheets. They were okay when the models were fine and simple. They're not anymore, and we need not necessarily R, but proper statistical tools. And also the Convoy consortium, which again is pushing the agenda to do a lot of VOI work in health economics. And I have to thank lots of people from whom I've stolen stuff from their slides and collaboration. And I think with that, I can thank you all.
Fantastic use of graphics and cuts, really good. I had noticed a particular sense of humor from Gianluca way back when you did the news. Do you remember the Bayesian news?
Yeah.
Yes. At one of the ISBA conference, and it was just so funny. Questions, please. And is there questions on the chat, Alison?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Thank you,
Sophia.
Gianluca. Wonderful talk.
you.
And I was really intrigued by the comment of the separation between people assessing efficacy and the costs. And I'm really curious as if you can expand a bit more on how we could go about it. I think in the oncology example that you were taking, part of the solution is collecting longer term follow-up to be able to assess that. But I'm really curious to think, if you think at earlier stages of development, could we change the way we do trials earlier on to try and better assess cost efficacy earlier on?
Yes, that's a very good point. So part of the work that I do for NICE is in a service that is called Scientific Early Advice. And the idea is that for companies who are thinking to submit a request for reimbursement to NICE down the line, to come very early, maybe at the stage where they're still developing their own main landmark trial. And what we do is to try and suggest, okay, if you're thinking of doing the trial, maybe also collect individual level data from a registry, because you know that the trial will have very, very short follow-up and your survival curve will not go down well enough, and we can do an extrapolation that is more sensible if we have external data. So I think that there are practices, but then it clashes with, I think, still the separation between the different regulatory agencies. Because if your main objective and immediate objective is to go to FDA or EMA, then this is somebody else's problem in a way. You know, eventually it will come in the same company, but on somebody else's desk. So for now, let's go to FDA. And it can become ugly because, again, it's something that you could get early on, and you could get the same people working on the same data throughout the whole process. But yeah, it's not always happening that way.
Thank you.
I think, Alison, we've got...
Yes, Gilbert Mackenzie, you've got your hand raised. We're just about to unmute you. So we should be able to hear you now, Gilbert.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, Gilbert. Very nice to hear from you.
Sorry, I didn't hear what Sylvia said.
I just said welcome. Very nice that you're following our lecture.
Oh, thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I think there are very many issues that arise from your talk. The one that struck me as you were going through the lecture was that this really leads to a multi-criterion view of randomized controlled trials for medical statisticians, where you have you have the economic evaluation, and now you have different dimensions of that economic evaluation, and these have to be considered too with things like efficacy. I mean, in the past, a lot of the studies, as you have correctly pointed out, have this problem of extrapolation. Typically, the follow-up time in randomized controlled trials is very short, and it's always been a problem to take long-term consideration, economic considerations into account thereafter. I wonder, could you comment on this idea of the multi-criteria aspect?
It's a very good point. Thank you. I think that certainly it is something that is lacking at the moment. We don't consider that. I don't know whether it would be easier to move towards multi-source rather than multi-criteria, perhaps, unless that's what you meant originally. So the idea that, well, the trial has to be the way it is because we can't do a trial for 20 years. It's just not feasible, and it's just not right. We want to get quicker information from the trial. But if we rely just on that, then we run into all these problems, and there's very little that we can do to get around them. If we rely on that and perhaps use electronic health records on, just at the baseline, for example, level of incidence for a particular disease, and then try and extrapolate fewer characteristics from the model, from the clinical trial data, then perhaps we have a better way of solving the problem. So I think I don't know, I haven't thought hard enough about this specific question, but I think my hunch would be that actually more than the multi-criteria idea, we need a multi-source idea, perhaps, if that makes sense.
Well, perhaps the theory, which has been very well developed, would be more persuasive if the trials were followed up. You've suggested doing it through electronic records. I think there's a quality issue there, but we won't go into that. I think that if the results and the predictions could be checked, I mean, I think it's good science to check the predictions somehow, and this would mean checking the economic predictions.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gilbert. I think Thomas.
Thank you. In your talk, you focused on evaluating one treatment at a time and have sort of implied a dichotomous, past the $20,000 per quality or something threshold. What about sort of going beyond the single evaluation? Is there any scope to say, okay, if I get one treatment that might cost 500 per quality, can I therefore adjust my boundary for something else so that my overall budget, or is this simply a too complex of a problem?
I think the complexity is not so much on the maths and the stats of this, but on the overall politics and the resources allocation. So in the UK, up until I think the first few years of the first Conservative/Lib Dem government, they had what they called the Cancer Fund something, I can't remember now. And essentially that was kind of going in that direction. And it was just saying, well, this is a specific area. It has some differences in comparison to everything else. And therefore, we're willing to increase the threshold for cancer drugs because we know that they're different than everything else. But there's been a lot of backlash, and lots of economists and lots of people working in the field thought that that actually was skewing up the overall provision of healthcare in a very bad way. And essentially, the Cancer Fund has been scrapped. And essentially, we've gone back to the idea that you need to have a very good reason to change the threshold for a specific evaluation. Because maybe, you have a very rare disease, but the treatment is really, really good and it's worth paying anyway. So it's more of an extra mathematical consideration rather than on the maths of what happens here. Because otherwise, it would be fairly simple to kind of change and play with the threshold and even have a multiple intervention comparison mathematically. But it gets much more complicated on the general wider picture, I think.
Chris, yeah, and then John.
Thank you very much, Gianluca. Just a very broad question about what we can do as statisticians to improve this field. Do you think that we've got all of the tools and methods available and it's just a matter of getting them into practice? Or do you think there are any specific areas that we could have better methods or better tools?
As you know, I think statisticians have everything that it takes to do everything, so we should do that. No, but jokes aside, I think there are some areas where methods maybe are implemented, and like all the work that we've been doing, and because you've been involved in terms of the VOI and Gaussian processes research, we haven't invented that. It was there, and we've just applied to the specifics of the problems that we had. And to some extent, there are things that makes it easier because we have a very well-structured problem where there's a clear utility function that we don't have to think very hard, and we accept that that's it. So we can just use not off the shelf, but things that are established and apply them. So I think there's a sense in which it's just a matter of increasing the critical mass and the statistical ability and sophistication of the whole of the discipline. In other cases, I think that there's very much space for new methodology. This idea of extrapolation of survival curves based on very limited information is an area for massive exploitation, I think. I don't know that we know everything that there is to know to actually make that more sensible. We're trying, we have some proposals, but that's certainly an area for open research there.
Thank you.
I think John.
Hiya. So the two kind of policy things, which I'll pose provocatively, deliberately. If the primary bar to getting treatments to patients is the economic evaluation, what's the point of the regulator? I mean, maybe the more polite version is how do we better align those processes? And then there's the second one, which is if we're going to use conditional approval more, which seems to make a lot of sense, do we require some element of randomization in that? And if so, how much? Or how do we manage that? Because once something's on the market, you know, if I had cancer now, I would want an immuno-oncology treatment. I wouldn't want to be randomized.
Of course. Yes, so good point. I think the first question, no, I don't think that, you know, you should scrap FDA and go directly to NICE. That wouldn't work because they do answer different questions. First, you want to make sure that the drug or the intervention actually doesn't kill people, let alone do something well to them, right? So you need to go through the hurdle. But I think that there should be a lot more coordination from the companies, knowing that they'll have to go through the different hurdles. And like I said, I don't know because I don't work for a pharma company, but I have worked with them and talked with lots of people. And it seems to me sometimes there may be an element of, well, I'll do this, and then some other department will pick up the pieces, and that's their problem with how they get there, you know. And that needs to be kind of more harmonized, but also at the point of the regulators as well, because I think they're trying, but they're very much separate entities. FDA, EMEA, they do their thing, and only then things come to NICE or whatever other authority, CADA, PBAC, and so on. So maybe more integration there doesn't necessarily solve the issues, but alleviate the problems, I guess. And the second point about randomization, well, I think that would not be possible, obviously. Once the drug is on the market, I think it would be very, very hard, even in a conditional setup, to just say, well, we'll keep randomized people. But maybe you could do staggered introductions in different areas. For example, you could have some kind of clustering in the design of how the conditional approval is made available for people. Or simply have to work on more complex models and methods because the data are purely observational. And in any case, for a lot of these complicated cases, you start off with a trial, but you end up having so many missing data, dropouts, that it's all informative. And yes, it's a trial, but really is observational data because the randomization is broken, you know, day 2 of the study.
I think Joseph had it.
Yeah, thanks so much. This talk was inspiring in many different ways.
Thank you.
I think one thing I'm curious about is, as you think about this, how are you going to try and incorporate people who have expertise in getting things adopted? So when you say statisticians should run things, I half agree, but I think you might be assuming that if statisticians know what to do, which is correct, and we just need to get people to do it. But to quote Obama, who you really like, he realized how little power there was in the presidency, right? So what I see here is that you have an innovation. It's not a technology, it's an innovation. And I love the quote you put up of why it wasn't being adopted. So would you collaborate with cognitive psychologists, with design scientists, the people who are taking all of the techniques you have and knowing that human beings don't understand uncertainty well, they have resistance to complexity, and then trying to figure out how do you convert that into like a tool that would actually get people to adopt it? Because I think, I mean, these ideas about Voi of information are fantastic, but most people won't really get them, and you can't get buy-in from every person. You almost have to have a tool that something's happening with. And there's all this literature on doctors not using, regression models that actually save lives. So what are your thoughts about that area? And I'm cross-pointed in psychology, so I'm really interested in how you think about it. And I think human-computer interaction, they deal with this a lot. You introduce a new product, like even virtual reality. How do you get people to buy into and adopt it? So I'm curious if you've thought about that and what directions you would go in there.
Yeah. So I think this isn't necessarily a new thing. When you go to a NICE panel, for example, it's not necessarily full of statisticians, and it's not all clinicians. You do have a spread of people, and even in the early scientific advice, there's kind of an unwritten rule that at all meetings, we need to have a public health expert, a clinician, a statistician, a health economist. So we try and cover the broad range. And jokes aside, I do think that this isn't something that one person or one discipline can solve. It has to be like a team effort in many ways. So absolutely agree on that. I don't know that you necessarily have, for this particular case, to make sure that the dissemination of the methods and their results go all the way to the general public. I don't think that the general public need to understand the value of information technicalities. They need to understand that a process has been going on, and they need to be told in very simple terms, look, it looks like you can't have this drug right now because we're not quite sure, and it is possible that we make a wrong decision and we waste your money, because essentially that's what it is. Then the technicality needs to happen at a higher level, I think, because otherwise it's a battle that you can never win. If you need to convince 60 million people of how these things work, then you might as well just, well, it's fun, so let's do it, but you will never win.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about the general public, but that quote you had where there was a recommendation not to use these methods, I think that whoever wrote that, they're missing something, and you need to somehow, I'm not sure what it is, but something about the psychology of how they think there's too much information. There's some translation I think that would have to happen there from perspective of psychology, from design science, from translational science to say, actually, here's the conditions under which these tools should be used. Okay. And here's why it's not too much information incorporated. That's more what I was thinking about.
Okay. I'll bring that to the convoy group. We'll make sure to have a psychologist on board. Thank you.
I had actually one question about rare diseases, because somehow it seems to me the paradigm is really geared against rare diseases, and each disease is actually rare, but if you take the collection, this is very important health problem, and we just can't ignore it. So I just was wondering, how is that treated as a whole body of special cases in a way, and how would you adjust the quality? All this analysis seems to me just falls down the line for rare diseases. You do need to treat them.
Yes, which is a bigger problem, though, in the whole of the pharmaceutical, for example, development, because obviously you have rare diseases, orphan diseases who are left by their own devices by and large. Well, not quite, but they don't get the same amount of funding and attention than others for all sorts of reasons, and that kind of trickles through to the decision-making process here. I think that a lot of the people who work in HTA would argue that, as sad as it is, this is for the greater good, because you want to maximize for the whole population. And so if there's a very limited amount of people who can benefit from a large amount of investment, then that takes away money from somewhere else where you can use it more effectively. I don't necessarily agree entirely on that. And it is not always necessarily the case that rare diseases would be associated with a large cost per outcome, essentially. Often they are, but it's an upstream sort of artifact, perhaps, because the development of those drugs or those interventions is so costly that when it comes down to the economic evaluation, then you're already bringing up a huge amount of money that is necessary to buy that intervention, for example.
Yes, but in a way, this is pretty short-term view, because we know by the continuum, we know that rare disease can be real models for more common disease and understanding. So it's very narrow and view. And I was wondering what is, and on top of it, when you add the breadth of the rare disease, it is a large section of the population. So altogether, which you basically are not considering by saying is the greater good of the other side of the population. So I was just wondering whether there's any shift, where is the debate on that, or whether it's kind of totally ignored?
I don't know if it's totally ignored. It's not center to the overall HTA debate. And again, I think you're making a very good point that overall the rare disease are actually not that rare, but there's a lot of heterogeneity within them, and therefore that also account in terms of the final evaluation to some extent. But I have to say, I'm not a massive expert on this. I've not worked very much on this, so there may be more going on.
Sorry, I mean, I was wondering about this as well, because it feels like rare diseases are different in one respect, which is the difficulty of getting further information. Some of the diseases are so rare that you couldn't run another trial, or it would take you 20 years. So I wondered how's that handled? It's not just the uncertainty about the benefit, but the difficulty of getting further information.
I think that there are provisions. So, for example, there are particular areas where there's no other treatment, and therefore you have sort of preferential access to the market, and therefore, even reimbursability, because, if there's really nothing else that people can get and they die if they don't get anything, then even in the face of large uncertainty, there are things that happen even at the point of reimbursement of interventions. And I suspect something like that might be going on for specific rare diseases as well. Yeah. I don't even know, to be honest, whether there's a massive drive from the manufacturers to actually go all the way. Obviously, the manufacturer wants to go past FDA with a drug for a rare disease. I don't know that they even put a lot of effort in trying to get to NICE, to get reimbursed, because, well, the odds are stacked against them, most definitely.
Well, I think we've had a very interesting debate. We've had a fantastic day. And before closing this part of the Armitage Day, I would like to express my great thanks to Brian for the organization, again to Alison for the detailed preparation, to our Armitage lecturer.
Thank you.
We gave a fantastic talk, and to all the speakers today. So I'd like to, for all of us, to express our great thanks to the very interesting talks that we've heard today. Thank you. Thank you.
Basically, just saying a big thank you to these guys. Sorry, I don't think I'm being heard now, but they have enabled us to run this as a hybrid event really successfully, and I'm really grateful to them. So I just wanted to give them a big thank you.
Yes. Absolutely, because I think hybrid events are definitely, I mean, if we compare to our average attendee for past events, which was around 100 and something, you know, by having a hybrid event, we do increase the audience. So we'll just, but of course, with a lot more, you know, technical background. But I mean, this is a very good experience for us, and we'll build on that.
Thank you.